Welcome, everyone, to Exterro's podcast, Data Exposure, the podcast for data risk leaders. I'm Fahad Diwan, and today we're unpacking an important problem plaguing organizations and legal, privacy, and security professionals everywhere. Many organizations have a what if we needed mindset when it comes to their data. They end up hoarding their data, well, forever, and they accept the risk that comes along with this. But as data and AI agents proliferate, the risk from this data hoarding is becoming too great, changing the risk reward calculus and tipping it in favor of starting to delete the unnecessary data. So that's what we're going to unpack today. How do we move away from this what if we needed mindset and start building a culture of defensible deletion? Joining us today is Ryan Zilm, Director of Information Governance at H2O America, with field-tested lessons you can use right now. A little bit about Ryan. He is an award-winning executive leader who brings over 29 years of focused experience in data strategy, risk management, and information governance. He currently leads information compliance strategies, ensuring adherence, privacy laws on HIPAA and CCPA at H2O America. He's also the founder and CEO of Z's Information Lifecycle Management. Throughout his career, including his time as Director of Enterprise Information Risk Services at USAA, he has driven multi-million-dollar cost savings by streamlining operations and launching automated enterprise retention tools. He is uniquely equipped for today's topic, having successfully transformed compliance sectors. For example, he conceptualized a content cleanup carnival. Try saying that 3 times really fast. That achieved over 55% employee participation, indexed over 550 record cases, and generated over almost $500,000 in cost avoidance. Welcome, Ryan. We're so happy to have you here. How's it going?
Thank you. Very happy to be here. What a great introduction as well.
Yeah, well, you got a great profile, and I think our audience is really going to benefit from the experience and expertise that you bring in. And before we dive in, I just want to say a quick note. The views and opinions expressed by Ryan in this episode are his own and don't reflect the official policies or positions of his current or former organizations. Just got to do that standard disclosure. So, Ryan, enough of me monopolizing the conversation. Our listeners want to hear from you. Take us back to the beginning. How did you find your way into information governance?
Yeah, it's been 30 years now this year, so it's just crazy to look back. And yeah, I started in information technology back in the 90s and I really liked it. It was factual, it was black and white, the ones and zeros and coding. And it was right around 2005 at a little change in career and found my way over into information management, records and information governance. And it was a lot of fun for me because I was coming from the IT realm. I was moving over into the legal space and being able to kind of be the liaison between the tech side and the legal side and kind of bridge that gap. And I very quickly fell in love with the space because, I think what I learned very early on was there is a science to what we do, that black and white, the regulatory compliance, so this is what you must do. But how you sell it and how you bring it to fruition inside of organizations is the art. And that was the fun. And those were the things that I thought, man, this is really cool. Let's see how we can do it. And I haven't looked back ever since. And I've been fortunate enough to roll out these programs in multiple organizations over the last 30 years. And each one of them's been different. And I think that's the fun of it, is trying to identify where organizations can thrive with these changing rules that we're experiencing and really helping their programs grow. So it's been tremendous, and I'm just so appreciative of all the experiences and the exposure that I've had.
That's amazing, Ryan. And I think the industry is appreciative of you too for bringing all of your experience and expertise to this space. I loved your point about how there's a component of science and art here. I think when it comes to creating a retention schedule, it can be very prescriptive. We have specific rules we need to follow that we can iterate upon. But then there's this whole human aspect to it of getting people to work together. And I think that's always more of an art than a science. And so when it comes to this more, working with people, changing mindsets, for the legal privacy and security listeners of this episode, how does the what if we needed, how would you say the what if we needed mindset actually increases their risk exposure?
Oh, wow. That's a really loaded question because I think everybody's kind of in this data hoarding mode right now because we see this as if I don't have it, I'm going to need it. And we've really expanded around, well, let me back that up. Let's say I've seen in cases where having it is not as beneficial as not having it and having defensible deletion in place. Without getting into specifics, sometimes those smoking guns can help us and sometimes they don't as much. So I think when you look at the overall risk of keeping things, it's that safety net, it's that security. And I think also the volume of information makes it really challenging for people to feel like they can let go, especially today. I mean, I think that my personal records, for example, probably are not managed as well as my organizational records. And I think that's because of volume and not knowing, what it is, how we should comply, because I don't have a person in my life other than myself who should be saying, this is how long you keep your financial records. This is how long you keep your other records. Whereas in organizations, we have somebody like me and others who should know what it is, should understand the risk, should understand what regulatory bodies we have to comply with and put those guardrails in place and those controls. But I think that the challenge is that mentality of, but I am going to need it. And
Mhm.
crossing that barrier of, well, you think you need it, but when it's gone and you don't have it, how easy would it be for you to recreate it if you truly needed it? And getting people over the hump, that's kind of the art that I found some huge successes with, as of late and over the last, I would say 10 to 15 years. When you make people feel comfortable with understanding what information they do need versus they don't need, it can be a huge win, a huge win.
Sounds like it can. And I love, love, love your point about how when you speak to people, you ask them, well, if we got rid of this data and we needed it again, how hard would it be to get this data again? That's a really insightful question to pose to help people get over the fear of getting rid of data that they might one day need. And so let's dive into specifics because you've worked at so many great organizations. You've done so many of these programs. And without obviously naming the organization, can you take us back to the moment where you realized a rot cleanup campaign was necessary at one of the organizations you worked at? What was happening inside the organization? What led to you thinking, hey, need to stop this data hoarding. We need to start defensively deleting, getting rid of some of this information?
Yeah, that's been, I think every organization I've been in needed a rot cleanup strategy, but some of them more significant than others just because of the level of risk that may be associated. And so when I looked at this and I said, we have these different applications that are not being managed. People don't know how to hit the delete button. So we need to put some automation in place for them. I started thinking about, well, this is the first time they'd hit delete ever. People who've worked in this organization for 15, 20, 30 years, there's this challenge with being able to hit delete. So educating people on why it's important to do it for that strategy, but also not giving them too much that it's overwhelming. Because if you think about,
Mhm.
if I've been in an organization for 30 years and we're going to put a strategy in place that says, hey, guess what? Anything over X period of time is just going to be gone because it meets said criteria, then we really have to kind of get them over that hurdle of understanding the why and the what. And every organization's been different. But what I did very, I think, successfully was breaking it down into bite sizes. And so we did this rot tier strategy where we said, listen, let's target these. We'll have a tier one, a tier two, and a tier three. Let's start with the tier three rot. Let's identify that as anything that's, let's say, over 10 years old that meets said criteria, like system files and other documents that just haven't been accessed in over 10 years. Let's start with that path. Let's grab it, let's find it, and then we can do maybe like a quarantine. Quarantine is a service, if you will, where it goes into this holding queue. People have access to it for, I don't know, say 90 days, and then they can review it, they can action it, or if they don't touch it, then it does go away. So that's that first bite. getting them familiar with what the process is and how they can get over that hump. And then after that, that next step in the phase of a ROT strategy would be 5 years. So that tier two, let's say it's anything over 5 years, and whatever your organization can do. If you're a younger organization, maybe you do 5 years, 2 years, and 1 year. Maybe you're, you can go a little bit stronger than that. But for this organization, it's going to be 10 years, 5 years, and 2 years. Because when you get them over the 10-year hurdle, then you can get them to the 5 years, but there's still a little more angst there, but still helping them understand. But you also have to make sure that they can be successful and that there's that automation in place, because the more manual that we make things, the less likely we are to get the follow up with those strategies. And putting that in place and calling it like a quarantine as a service. So it is a service we're providing to get rid of the stuff for you, but we do want you to have access to it in case you need it. But if you don't action it, then it would be removed. And putting that strategy in place was significant. I mean, when you think about organizations, I've worked in organizations that were in 120 countries with hundreds of thousands of people. When you think about the volume of data we're talking about from something as simple as anything that hasn't been accessed over 10 years, it just can be so huge. And then you look at the ROI and the cost savings and storage savings and just that risk overall being reduced. Pretty incredible to have something like that come to fruition.
Thanks, Ryan. As you were speaking, and my mind was just lighting up. Things that you were saying just made it make so much sense. And one thought that I had was about your quarantine as a service. It reminded me of this advice that one of my friends gave me once, and he said, "Fahad, if you ever want to get rid of clothes you don't really wear, but you're still hoarding, at the start of each year, turn the hanger around for all of your clothes in the closet. So the hangers are all facing the other way. And then when you do wear that piece of clothing, you turn the hanger the opposite way. And then at the end of the year, the hangers that are still facing away from you, the ones that you faced away from you at the beginning of the year, well, those are clothes that you didn't wear in the past year and you can get rid of. And that was one way that I got over the fear of, getting rid of clothes that I may one day need. And so when you were talking about quarantine as a service, excuse me, I thought that it was such a genius idea, because if we don't go straight to deletion, if we say, look, we'll move this information to a quarantine environment, we'll archive it. And so you can always get it back if you need it. It might get people over the hump, over that fear of getting rid of some of that unnecessary data. And then after 10 years, that individual hasn't gone back and retrieved some of that quarantine data, then we can safely say, look, there's no way you need this data. There's no way this organization needs this data. We can now purge this from archive as well. And so I want to double click on, I think one of the great expertise that you have, Ryan, is getting people comfortable with this idea because of the experience and expertise you've had over the years building these programs. And you've touched upon it and multiple times already. But I really want to dig into how you get buy-in, because data deletion or archiving data touches upon the information governance professional in an organization, but also the information security and privacy and legal and data governance, which I want you to dig into. So can you answer two questions for us? One is, can you talk to us about a time when all of these different data stakeholders, let's call them legal, IT, security, and governance, weren't aligned, and how you brought them all together to be aligned? And as a part of your answer, can you help this often confused terminology? Can you help us distinguish between information governance and data governance? Because I'm sure I'm not the only one that's confused about this.
Oh boy, that's a huge can of worms. We can get into that a little bit. But let me answer the first question, because it's really important for people to understand that the art has to have heart. And what I
Mm,
mean by that is people are, we're humans. We interact differently with different people. We respond differently. And when you have misalignment on your strategy, when you have misalignment on processes, or when you can get rid of data, for example, you have to bring people over the hump. And the art part of what I was talking about earlier is really about people. It's about coming to the table with them, understanding, where do they hurt when you say, I'm going to take your data away, and then helping them across that finish line. I've been in many organizations where people are just, they're very reluctant to get rid of things. They're very reluctant to change in any type of a program, especially for information or data governance programs. We have to get them comfortable. And I think that's where I've really tried my hardest to build relationships first before I
Mm.
go in and just turn things up and say, oh, we're going to roll out this new program and your stuff's going to be deleted. And every organization I've been in, that has been kind of the way. And I'll give you some examples that are kind of fun. Those people are watching, still love you, hope everything's good. But there was one organization that I worked in where we started off with like files on the shelf and we were pulling files, right? And people could walk in and pull files, physical files out of a storage room. There was no security. And so we make a change. And that's when they're like, oh, wait, I can't come in and get my own files. And that was kind of step one. And then it went to, all right, well, now we're going to start helping you out with a content management system where things could be placed there instead of stored on a shared drive or things of that nature. And I'll tell you that the people that we were working with were very challenging. And one of them was an engineer. And when I remember I was saying to my team, like, hey, we should really bring this person on board. Let's get them in our pilot group. And they were like, oh, but why? Why? This one person is just the worst person. I'm like, but that's going to be your biggest advocate in the long run. So we brought her on board. I asked her if she was interested. She's like, absolutely. If things are going to change, I want to have a say in it. And I kid you not, she became the biggest advocate for moving things forward because she felt like she was a part of the change and she could get her questions answered up front. That is how you get that alignment. When you get it from that one person who's your naysayer, and then they socialize it to their team, who socialize it to their supervisors, and then just that information gets disseminated like, hey, they're helping us. Things like that, even in smaller places like out in the field. I worked in oil and gas for 25 of my 30 years, and I would go to towns of 500, 2,000 people, and we'd have small offices. And I remember one time I
Mhm.
was in an office, and I was there to try to do a information management type change. But instead of coming in guns blazing, I was talking to the office assistant there, and she's like, yeah, well, corporate's here. And I'm like, I'm sorry, because I tend to wear this with jeans. I have on jeans, but it's typically something
Yeah.
like this. And she's like, yeah, well, okay, but our printer's broken. I'm like, great. We were doing a scanning project. And I'm like, oh, I'll look at your printer for you, not a problem. Went over there, fixed it, got the printer working. I think it was simple as, the printer cartridge wasn't installed properly. But those small wins help people to trust you. And when you earn their trust, making those changes and getting that alignment across not just the levels where people are out in the field working, but even at the senior leadership level and people getting to see that you're helping their people through operational changes and things, that has been by far the most significant thing I would say that people need to take and use to their advantage to get alignment across the entire organization.
Wow, Ryan, I would have never expected that response. And again, very insightful, right? I think when we often talk about getting buy-in, people will come in and say, Fahad, you got to communicate how your objectives align to their objectives, which I think there is merit to it. I don't want to belittle that point. But what I love about your point was you said it, put the relationship first. Build trust through any means. Show that you're there to help through any means. Like you came in, you fixed the printer. It arguably has nothing to do with information governance. But then you establish that rapport, this idea that, look, I'm here to help. You can trust me. I don't want to make your life more difficult. And then you get that type of cooperation from the people that will ultimately have to help you in that information governance program. And so I love, love, love that. So when we're trying to build buy-in with IT, with legal, with privacy, with information governance and data governance, which you still owe us a quick, distinction between the two. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
from what I understood is go out and just first make a relationship with your stakeholders in those different departments, including the naysayers. And I think from if I understood you correctly, that will go a long way. But I'm not letting you off the hook, Ryan. I think we need to know what is the difference? What is information governance? What is data governance?
I will give you my take on it. Everyone kind of has their own take. And I do think that it's become challenging. Some of the lines have been blurred. It was records management, became information governance, and there's this super discipline of information governance. that kind of has records management and other pillars inside of it. But when I think about an organization and I want to communicate to somebody information governance versus data governance, I like to take a look at information governance being kind of that overarching, what information do we have in the organization? How long do we have to keep it? What do we need to do to comply with it? Just at an information level, which I think is a little bit more, I don't want to say superficial. Maybe it's more official or super official. I don't know. But
Hmm.
then data governance, when I think about data governance, you're talking about things like master data and reference data and the data elements like rows and columns and things of that nature. And I think sometimes we get lost in this, well, information, but data is information, but they are two
Yeah.
very distinct disciplines, just like knowledge management would be another one. And that sometimes the lines get blurred because there are people who specialize in these disciplines, but organizations, for lack of understanding, tend to dump them all into one bucket.
Hmm.
And we tend to lose sight of how we should be enabling data governance versus information governance and records management and knowledge management. Now, they all do integrate and they partner very well together, but there are distinct differences. And I would say if you are unsure, I strongly suggest that you go out there and take a look and review and understand, and then make your own opinion as to what you think the differences are. But I do think we get a bad rap for that mix of things, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up.
And thanks for clarifying. So I have a couple of follow-on questions. I think, do you think perhaps the confusion originated from the fact that information governance is an older discipline before we had this boom of data? I mean, from my understanding, organizations have had to manage records since maybe the 70s, even before that, if I'm not mistaken. So, and yeah, so what do you think? Do you think that has an element there? Or am I reaching here?
I think it does. I think it's evolved. I think records management has been around for basically eons, if you will, right? Data governance is the buzzword in my mind, in my opinion only, that is the hot topic for the last, let's say, 10 years, roughly. I guess I'm a little older, so maybe 15, we'll say, maybe 20. But I think it's also, we didn't really have records managers in place like we do now. We didn't really have information governance, which is kind of how it evolved. But we did have data analysts. We did have a database person for each of our applications, even when I started working in the 90s. And I remember looking back and thinking, like, what a cool job. But back then, it was more finite. And I think it's just continued to evolve. And the volume of information, the amount of changes in regulatory requirements around even something as simple as prompts, like, oh, we have to keep prompts now for X number of years to comply with regs in California if you're decisioning. And just I think it
That's
has
interesting.
changed so much that you can throw anything at it. But I think the discipline itself can be very different than the roles and responsibilities within organizations. And that's where I think there's this intersection that we just haven't found the right balance. Because if I say
Hmm.
records information governance to you, you can think in your mind, oh, that means they're going to be doing records, they're going to be putting some governance around applications, and that's this. But in practicality, inside of my organization, that may not be what I do at all. I may only do physical records, but the name of the organization may be different. So it's kind of it's an interesting question. I don't think there's a finite answer to it, but I can just kind of tell you what I've seen. Everybody they interact with, they're like, oh yeah, I'm records management. And I'm like, oh really? What do you do? And they're like, oh yeah, I manage the system over here and I do enterprise content management and I do knowledge management. And I'm like, oh wow, because that's your role and responsibility in your organization. There's always this need and there's a give and take of what an organization needs versus what we call the discipline. And that those blurred lines are just they're there and I think they will always be there.
Right. And as you said, because it's such an evolving space. And if I understood your points correctly, I think there's a context dependency. Each organization has its own context, their own terminologies. And so perhaps they use information and data. They have definitions for those two terms that differ from another organization. And if I understood your distinction correctly, the way I now understand it is information governance is managing the life cycle of the information within an organization. Data governance is more specifically about having a centralized source of truth for data and then managing the quality of that data to derive insights. I know it might be a gross oversimplification, but is that like a
I
90,
like
80,
it.
90% there? Yeah?
I
Okay.
like it. No, I think that was very well summarized. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. So I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I want to circle back to a point that you touched upon earlier. Now, before I say this, I don't want to be flippant, right? I don't want to ignore the very real reasons that organizations are reluctant to delete data. And you talked about this earlier. There's the risk of spoliation. Organizations are worried that they might delete data that they need for litigation. And there are a multitude of retention requirements that say that organizations have to retain data for a specific number of years. And if they don't, they could be penalized. And now I just learned from you that apparently prompts have to be retained for a certain number of years in certain jurisdictions.
Mhm.
But for teams worried about legal defensibility, which I think is what this all boils down into, right? People don't want spoliation because they don't want to be indefensible or have done something indefensible in a legal context, or they don't want to get rid of a record that they ultimately need, which could result in them being sued for X, Y, and Z. But for teams really worried about legal defensibility, how does a continuous and preferably software automated data disposition actually reduce the risk of that comes from data rather than creating the risk?
Great question. It boils down to one word for me, and that's consistency. When
Hmm.
you look at the human element of a process or a procedure or deletion, the human element makes it inconsistent. Whereas if you put a technology in place that's going to remove it, even if it does it wrong, it's going to be removing it wrong, we'll say, consistently. And that then helps your defensibility, especially when you go, for a case and have to say, yes, this is what happened, but it did happen consistently. If we have human element in place when it comes to deletion, and I've seen this a few times where, one person will look at a document and go, oh, no, I need that. I have to keep that. And then they keep it. And then another person who has the exact same documents, like, oh, no, don't need it, delete. Well, why was that decision made? How do we make that decision? And then is that defensible? Well, no, it's because either we didn't train them properly, we didn't educate them on the needs and the necessities. We also didn't give them the tools to understand that in some cases. So having a policy, having a retention schedule, that's only half the battle. Communicating to employees or those who are holding your information about why it's important to remove things, why it's important to keep things for the duration that you're needed, and even the complexities now with like max retention periods, having to explain where it used to be like, oh, this piece of paper, you have to keep it for 7 years. Well, now it's saying, oh, you have to keep it for no more than 3 years. And it's like, oh, so do I keep it one day or do I keep it 36 months and then I get rid of it? Like, what's that complexity? I think giving people technologies to manage that to where it is, for lack of a better word, it is decisioning for you. But those processes, keeping it consistent, uh, is really going to help, win your cases, maybe reduce your fines if you do something that you should be doing. It's been a very challenging space for us to manage those, but I think the tech is helping, but we still need the humans to help us with the tech to put it in
Yeah.
place, to train people and to really understand it. But it's evolved so much where I think about at the beginning of my career, it was just auto classification was all that we had. Well, that was not very, very good. And now with, AI just taking off and helping us do some things differently, the consistency in what tech can do for us has, I would say, increased our percentage of defensible programs because we are removing the human element. And when I say human element, I want to be clear. It's not like we're removing the humans. They're not involved at all. It's just the decisioning on when to keep information and when not to. That's key for me is I want to be able to say, yes, we did it. We did it consistently. We either held this information or we got rid of this information because our tech was in place and it was operating efficiently and consistently.
I couldn't agree more. I think humans are a necessary part of the puzzle here. We need the humans to, well, get buy-in, work with the technologies, but technologies, like you mentioned, will bring in this element of consistency across the board on how long to retain data. And we've moved so far ahead from just auto classification. Now at Exterro, our solution can not only precisely identify how long to retain a specific piece of structured or unstructured data, but link it to legal hold, link it to retention requirements, and essentially do all the heavy lifting for employees of an organization so that they can focus on the softer factors of building buy-in, building those relationships, getting people comfortable with the idea of deleting data, and then working with our automated workflows to get rid of that data. And so now you've already there's so much great wisdom here, Ryan, and I would love for you to boil it down into just a few actionable items that listeners could take in the next 90 days. So if listeners to this episode could implement one change in the next 3 months to reduce data hoarding in their organization and build a culture of defensible deletion, what should it be? What do you recommend?
One thing, my goodness, just one.
Just one.
I mean, I think it goes back to uh, building relationships and understanding what that factor is. So when I think about motivation, like what motivates people, understanding that. Early in my career, I was told just go to lunch and just ask people, talk to them, build
Mm,
those relationships. I think that it would behoove anyone listening to figure out who your biggest naysayers are, take them to a lunch, a coffee, a virtual, whatever you need to do, and spend just 15 minutes and ask them, like, hey, so I know you have this application, or I know that you're really struggling with the fact that we're removing your email pretty soon. Walk me through what that looks like for you. Or would you be a part of this pilot? And really listen to where the fear's coming from. Because a lot of times when I have rolled these systems out or these
yeah.
changes, it's like, oh, well, one time it was deleted and I just have this fear that it's going to be accidentally deleted. It's like, oh, well, we do have a backup plan. We can do recovery. It is now stored in the cloud on said, walking them through kind of what that looks like. I think the one piece of advice though really boils down to that. Just sitting with them, talking to people, understanding where any fear of change comes from, especially around any of those components so that you can get to a place where you can hit the delete button, but delete with them being comfortable and doing it with
Mm,
them even. Bring them into a pilot and say, do you have any data that you know should be deleted? And let's just walk through it and see how comfortable you are in that process. And, thinking about things like terminated user data. There are some organizations that don't have processes around a user who's been gone for 10, 20, 30 years. Well, maybe
mm,
we start there. So why don't we sit down together and let's hit delete on this data, but let's first look at it and make sure there's nothing there that you need. And then they can help you even build your processes. But I like to use those most challenging people. And I think that is key to success for any program, information governance, data governance, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're trying to achieve. Find those people and engage them and let them become your best friends and ask them, you're going to roll something out though, that's the person I want on my team. That's the person I want in a pilot. I want to
mm.
make sure that that person who's going to give me the most challenging answers or responses is on board and has said every single thing that they can think of. Because if they give me their list of 12 items that they're uncomfortable with, if I can tackle those and make them comfortable, the rest of the organization should be a piece of cake.
Right. And that way your greatest naysayers can become your greatest allies.
100%.
In terms of by addressing their concerns, you make your process better and better and better. Thanks, Ryan. This was an incredible conversation. I hope our listeners are going to love this episode as much as I did. A lot of what you said deeply resonated with me, especially the point about leading with relationships to get buy-in. And then naturally, I'm a technologist at heart. So I loved your point about using tech to be consistent in these programs, to have consistent policies, to have consistent application of the policies. So thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Ryan, again for the amazing session. This is Data Exposure. Please subscribe and follow so you don't miss the next episode. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks again, Ryan, for joining us. I'm Fahad Diwan. See you next time.